Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Stanley Bill and Ben Stanley. Stanley is professor of Polish Studies, University of Cambridge. He's also the chair of the Cambridge Committee for Russian and East European Studies. Ben is associate professor for the Center for the Study of Democracy, and they are the authors of the book Good Change, The Rise and Fall of Poland's Illiberal Revolution. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about the rise of the Law and Justice Party, also known as PiS, and neoliberalism. We talk about Poland post-1989 and liberalism, and the impact of globalization and Western influence on Poland. We talk about Poland A and Poland B, and the rural and urban divide in Poland. Some of the cultural issues and backlash, institutional challenges, Poland's current economics, the future of Poland, and many more topics. I've been very interested in Poland's economic growth and some of their politics in the past couple of years. They've been doing very, very well. And this book is very timely, and both Stanley and Ben were just wonderful, great guys, brilliant researchers. I can't recommend the book highly enough. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there to the Substack, subscribe, share with your friends, and now I bring you Stanley and Ben. I am here with Stanley Bill and Ben Stanley. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to speak to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. As I was mentioning, you guys have the good fortune of two Stanleys writing on Poland, so that's definitely memorable. And even more memorable is the book you guys wrote, which is it's great. I really, really enjoyed it. It's got some of the wonderful details and some graphs and stats and all this stuff in there, but it's also very readable, which I found very, very helpful about some of the recent political changes in Poland. So the book is Good Change, The Rise and Fall of Poland's Illiberal Revolution, and that's out through Stanford University Press. And so we're going to talk all about it. So before we do, why don't we just hear who you both are? So just tell us professionally, academically. Stanley, I'll start with you first. Why don't you just tell us who you
are? Thank you. So I'm professor of Polish Studies at the University of Cambridge. And I work on a few different things. So politics, of course, in this instance, and especially with Ben, but I also do some work on Polish literature and culture and some translation of Polish literature as well. So I have a few different hats that I wear.
Very nice. Ben?
I'm an associate professor at SWPS University in Warsaw. I'm British, but I've lived and worked in Warsaw for sort of best part of 10 years now. I focus above all on party politics, on voting behavior, on public opinion, and similar matters. So I'm sort of more kind of classically political scientist, whereas Stan ranges across several disciplines, which has been very useful in the writing of the book.
One of the things I've realized is that the British are obviously got a great education system, and they'll go all over the world and start writing about all these places with such great prowess and great academic rigor. It's really, really nice. I've seen this a bunch of times where be like, yeah, I'm British, but I'm here in Greece, and I've been living here for X amount of years. It's like, that's amazing. So you guys training in academics.
Well, in my case, Xavier, it's even more exotic because I'm originally from Australia. So I'm in the UK now. Also studied for a while in the US, actually.
Oh, yeah?
And Poland. I lived in Poland for over 10 years altogether. So yeah, we range far and wide.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know whether you've talked to many people in sort of academia who have the same sort of story as us, but essentially both of us went over to Poland to teach English originally, and just sort of fell in love with the country, the culture, and the history. And it's a constant sort of story among a lot of people that I've come across in academia who specialize in this sort of, particularly in these less well-known European countries. They left university, went off somewhere for a bit of an adventure, went and lived and worked there for a couple of years, and ended up almost kind of falling into it without having expected to, which, if you speak English as a first language, you have the privilege of being able to do without much problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, there's certain parts of the world where I also have sort of, kind of fell in love with the history and culture and things like that. And so, I am sympathetic towards that for sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about the PIS, which is Poland's, what is this, Law and Justice Party. I think these are the PIS stands for the Polish names. But yeah, after 2015, how did the PIS come to power on the promise of good change? And how did they prioritize, neoliberal fiscal discipline with some progressive culture policies? We can talk about post-'89 communism, stuff like that. But before we do, I just kind of right there, the heart of it, the center, you drop us into kind of 2015 PIS, and then kind of up to 2023, and now it's different. With Tusk, who's the current prime minister in Poland, and a little bit different. But yeah, for a good almost 10 years there. They were in charge. So yeah, what is this party? How did they come to power? And what was the kind of neoliberalism thing that they were doing?
Well, maybe I'll start with just a general overview answering that question, but then Ben can perhaps go back and tell you more about where this party comes from.
Sure.
But our book is about this party, as you say, PIS, or PiS is how the acronym is usually pronounced in Poland. It's Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, which is law and justice, as you said. So the PiS party, which came back into power, in fact, it had been in a government before, but it managed to win a majority on a single party list for the first time, really, that had happened in Polish politics after 1989 in 2015. So it had this majority. It was able to enact a lot of its plans. And in our book, we trace how they came to power in 2015. We talk about how they expanded that power, expanded their parliamentary majority in the 2019 elections, and then how they lost power in 2023, as you said, to a coalition of parties led by Donald Tusk, who's a leader of a liberal centrist party in Poland, who is now the prime minister. So PiS, or law and justice, there are various potential definitions of it. Is it a right-wing conservative party? Is it a populist party? Is it a national conservative party? Is it a national populist? Is it a radical right party? We talk about some of these questions and pull them apart in the book. But the good change that they came to power on, in a sense, was what they characterize as the liberal establishment of Polish politics before 2015, that they're reacting against, and that they are, or at least attempting to draw on a sense of public dissatisfaction with that establishment, of course, amplifying that dissatisfaction by their own political arguments. And that dissatisfaction would be with, as you said, in broad terms, the sort of neoliberal approach to the economy that had been inherited after Poland's transformation of 1989, with a progressive direction, let's say, of cultural politics. Now, to what degree that was really the case is something that we examine in the book, but certainly from the point of view of conservatives in Poland, there was this danger of the Western progressive cultural agenda invading Poland with LGBT plus rights, various aspects of women's rights, migration as well, immigration. So these kinds of questions that would be familiar from culture war battles in many countries across the world. So the good change was about sort of putting things back on a sort of conservative track, about resisting the neoliberal consensus in the economy on fiscal discipline to actually, and this is an important part of the party's popularity, to in fact increase social spending, increase state spending on various kinds of redistributive mechanisms, including a very popular child benefit scheme, including putting the retirement age that had been lowered by the previous government back up again, and a range of social benefits that meant that the good change is a combination of this left-wing economics, in inverted commas, with this turn back to social redistribution, and right-wing cultural politics. So we talk about it in the book as a kind of left-right combination that sort of cuts across traditional divides. And for your American listeners, I mean, that's something that would be interesting about this party, or odd about this party, if you're looking at the US scene, because this party would have a lot in common with the Republican Party and certainly with the MAGA crowd and so on cultural politics. But on the side of social spending, I think there'd be some rather significant differences. Certainly, as a traditional Republican position, very, very much against that kind of approach, whereas the peace government was combining those two aspects. So that's sort of who the party is in this period, and what we focused on in the book, and explaining the popularity of that party. But there's an earlier history of the party as well that Ben can probably say a bit more about.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, Ben, if you want to jump in here, I mean, obviously there's, Poland. I mean, there's, in deep history, Poland has a history. There's Poland, post 1945, but then, post 1989, after communism falls, you guys talk about in the book, this kind of round table for shifting the conversation on politics and economics, and they didn't really look for liberal individualism, right? And Tusk's Freedom Union was kind of in the 90s. And these, what I found in I'm reading the book, is there's a lot of these players kind of are there, and then they come back, and then they go back. There's a kind of receding kind of thing. But how did this kind of happen, kind of post 89 after communism, things like that, where they're getting to this point in 2015 where it's like, okay, let's kind of do it this way now that we're here. What's the kind of brief snapshot there?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to point out here that sort of 2015 was a point at which there was very much determination on PiS's part to go back to revisit essentially the political settlement of 1989 and onwards, and they were still arguing then essentially that transition from communism to liberal democracy in Poland had been done in a way which was fundamentally flawed, and that it would be necessary to essentially to establish a new constitutional settlement in place of the one that currently existed. To what extent those positions were held sincerely, and to what extent this was just a convenient argument for a party like PiS to be making, is an open question. But it's certain that we know from the observation of the Law and Justice PiS leader, Jarosław Kaczyński, over a number of years, that he has consistently made the argument that the political settlement of 1989 and after was fundamentally flawed in many ways. To understand current Polish politics and much of what we write about in the book, it's necessary to understand that essentially both parties represent sides of the political debate which have are dealing in different ways with unresolved questions after the end of communism and the beginning of transition. On the one hand, we have the current governing party, the one led by Donald Tusk, which is Civic Platform, which is part of a broader coalition that at present governs Poland, who are sort of attached to the institutional and political settlement after 1989. Essentially, refer back to that as a moment in Poland, in Polish history, where things were essentially put on the right track. Despite their differences, despite their disputes, I think none of the current coalition would dispute the idea that 1989 was a moment where Poland was able to to change fundamentally for the better. Whereas Law and Justice, led by Jarosław Kaczynski, would dispute that. So, I mean, they initially came to prominence in 2001 as a party that was predominantly anti-communist in its focus. And one of the reasons why they were anti-communist, why they were so sort of insistent on this theme, was because they expressed this view that essentially the changes of 1989 had not been entire in their effects, that communists had essentially simply transposed the power that they had under communism to the new political system, and that a proper transition where the elites of the communist period were properly brought to justice and brought to a reckoning for what they'd done under communism hadn't occurred. And so as the topic of anti-communism became less significant a part of the Polish political discourse, they started to develop a more anti-liberal profile. So essentially saying not so much pushing on the idea that communists had continued to dominate the political scene in Poland over the last 30 years, but gradually pushing more and more of the blame onto this liberal ideology that they saw as having fundamentally determined what happened in Poland after 1989. So, as Stan was saying, they criticized the existing sort of neoliberal orthodoxy of economic politics. They also criticized and took action against what they saw as the kind of creeping westernization of Poland's socio-cultural policy and general direction of travel. So they've changed from a party that was quite narrowly focused on anti-communism to one which is much more sort of attentive to a more general anti-liberal critique of post-communist politics. So in that sense, by the time we reached 2015, the key political dispute in Poland had become not the previous one between communists and inheritors of the communist regime and anti-communists, but rather this dispute between people who were, on the one hand, pretty much sort of pro-market, socially progressive, interested in integration with the European Union and with other multinational institutions, and on the other side, this side of Polish politics represented by PiS, which was very skeptical, not anti-market, but skeptical towards neoliberalism, certainly, which was skeptical of the impact of westernization in sociocultural sense, and which was very hostile to European elites and the idea of political institutions from outside being able to affect decisions that were made within Poland. So it turned from quite a narrow critique of the post-communist political elite into a kind of holistic critique of the last 30 years of Polish politics. And essentially, the dispute between those two sides, between pro-Western, pro-capitalist, pro-social progressive forces on the one hand, and those who oppose those on the other, has really formed the basic line of competition in Polish politics over the last 15 to 20 years.
Both of you guys explained that well. I guess the follow-up here I have is, Poland is part of Eastern Europe. There's a different history there. And it is interesting that post 89, post communism, it doesn't sound like Polish people are running into the arms of liberalism, and I think many people suspect that liberalism is pure form of democracy. You can come out of the hammer sickle, blah 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 shadow, but it turns out, and I've read and heard about this from other places, it's not always directly to this kind of Western, as you're saying, liberal or democracy. And I guess what is it about? Is there a kind of space where people look out into the world and they kind of see there's some nice things about that, but we don't like all those things, so we're not gonna buy that. We're gonna try and do something else, maybe a hybrid, maybe something else. What is the kind of, before 2015 throughout, there's this really, really interesting bit in Polish politics where, is it Kaczynski, right? He's the prime minister. It turns out him and his brother were president and prime minister at the same time, which is it's a wild thing to think about. But in 2006 and 2007, there's all these parliamentary reforms. There's, things with the constitution. Why was it, in that interim between 89 and 2015 during the, 90s and 2000s, it didn't go to, not that it should have, but why didn't it go to liberalism or, kind of this pure, strict democracy like other places? And how did they kind of chart their own way of sorts? What was, I guess, sort of motivating that or animating that in a sense?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question that you ask, and you put it really clearly. It is something that's a kind of fundamental dilemma, really, when thinking about Polish politics after 1989, but also in Central and Eastern Europe more generally, and that sort of sphere of countries coming out of communist regimes into democratic regimes. And that is a tension between, on the one hand, a kind of imitation, and on the other hand, a self-assertive, separate path, as you describe it, right? And sort of claiming a kind of separate type of political identity as well as a national or other identity. So on the one hand, imitation is in many respects the dominant, right? And it's the dominant of the democratization process after 1989, in the sense that Poland and the other Central and Eastern European countries are striving to join a range of Western institutions, right? Be it NATO in 1999 or the European Union in 2004. And particularly in the case of the European Union, that means a requirement to meet a set of standards, sort of convergence criteria in the way that institutions are run, the way that democracy is organized. And then, of course, it's also seeking to grow its economy and to restructure its economy from a very, very low base, which again means accepting a whole range of principles that are demanded by major Western economies and other entities that can come and invest in the country and support the growth that the Poles would aspire to. And again, the imitative dimension is in the aspiration for the same standard of living as people living in Western countries. And then also in comparison with this sort of authoritarian regime that still existed until 1989, albeit in a watered-down version in some moments. There's an aspiration for the democratic institutions also to imitate those that Poles would have looked to before 1989, with a kind of longing, right, to have that sort of organized, to have freedom of movement, to have free elections and so on. So there's, on the one hand, imitation is in many ways the main direction of development after 1989, but increasingly that is mixed with a critique of some of those Western institutions, some of those Western values, and a sense that, or a growing understanding that the West which previously might have been idealized, isn't perfect. And there are aspects of Western institutions that we might not want to apply in exactly the same way, or at least that's what, of course, we can't talk about Poles as a monolith. There are many different groups and individuals who would look at this differently, but it's certainly a growing sense that Poland, although it absolutely is part of the West in that sort of broad terms, in inverted commas, and is a democracy very much, and that's not something that would be questioned as a path by many in Poland. But the form, and you said, I think the way you explained this was very, very correct, that this idea that the form of that might be different in our case, right? There might be multiple paths to democracy, and that we don't like the way, and here I'm sort of ventriloquizing what those in the peace circles or those circles questioning the liberal orthodoxy might put it, that we don't like the way in which some of these Western countries have developed, right? So sometimes there would be a sense that the West, in its progressive, again, the caricatured way in which it might be presented by conservatives in Poland, in its excessive progressivism, its excessive permissive philosophy, and so on, has actually moved away from its own original core values, and we as Poles we're going to defend the original values of the West. We're going to defend a proper version of democracy, right? A representative democracy, a democracy where there isn't censorship for saying things that are politically incorrect or so on, right? These are the kinds of arguments that would be presented. So it is this complex combination of, on the one hand, imitation, but on the other hand, a growing resistance. And I think when you talk about why 2015, I think there are a number of steps in that process where this questioning of the path sort of increases, and some of them might be the global financial crisis, and the sort of blow to a whole European economies, the general sort of let's say the general sort of end of the process of European integration as one in which it was one step after another, right? So the idea that there was a questioning of how far European integration should go in Europe more generally at this time. Then the migration crisis in Europe in 2016. So all these things that might have led to a growing questioning of where Poland should seek to fit itself in these institutions. And just to conclude before Ben comes in, just while never at any point in any sort of major mainstream way in Polish politics was there a force seeking to question Poland's membership entirely of Western institutions or the European Union even. I mean, that's still a very, very much a minority view in Poland, the idea that Poland should leave the European Union or that Poland shouldn't want to have a democracy and so on. So it's within those institutions, what particular path should we take?
Yeah, before Ben gets in here, just to follow up, and maybe Ben, you can kind of get at it, is I just think from a Polish perspective, when you're thinking about these things, there's you have Russia to the east of you, and that's a pretty big power economically and militarily and all these things. Then you have the rest of the West, right? With the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and then the United States. And I have to just think about and imagine, if you're Polish, there are things that you're not going to like about a lot of those places, and there's things you are going to like. But when you're trying to do it your way, that has to be difficult when you're at that moment in 2015 when we're really hitting kind of the full effects of globalization, right? And obviously everybody interconnected through the internet and social media and all these other things, and having to vie for kind of a space that I can imagine there has to be these, like, okay, how do we do it our way and take some things, but the Polish way, but there you are having to entertain, like, yeah, but we live in a globalized space. You've seen some of this, in neighboring Czech Republic and Prague, and how they've also had to handle and battle some of these things as well. You can't just be kind of on your own, maybe you could have, 40 years ago. Now you have to kind of have, on the global market, financially, economically, politically, have to kind of contend with that. And it seems interesting. So we can talk about some of the aspects there with Poland, but that they're having to kind of figure that out in this space with peace. But we'll get to a little bit later about kind of where they are currently, and I wonder if there's a sort of ripple effect of how they were trying to sort through that. So Ben, anything you want to answer here on this follow up, or just that idea of kind of Poland figuring out their way along a kind of globalized more economy?
Yeah, I think it's been both an opportunity and a source of frustration for law and justice, for peace. That on the one hand, they can make use of the significant sort of political potential in both anti-Russian and anti-German rhetoric. I mean, nobody lost support in Poland by bad-mouthing the Russians, and increasingly bad-mouthing the Germans has come to be a profitable sort of political tactic. So on the one hand, they know that there is the potential for being there is plenty of potential in being the party that is trying to kind of innovate a domestic political agenda, a sort of a properly Polish political agenda, rather than one that imitates models taken from elsewhere. On the other hand, as Stan mentioned, we're still in Poland in a society where there is, on the one hand, appetite for that sort of Polish way of doing things, but at the same time, a significant level of support at the same time for integration with those kinds of political institutions that are multinational in character and that are, by their very nature, based on collaboration and compromise in international arenas. So there's something like still 85% support for the membership of the European Union, and still quite a significant level of support for ongoing political and economic integration within the European Union. So what PiS has had to contend with is how to kind of find a balance between making use of those sort of nativist energies that we see in Poland and that desire for innovating a different path of development, while at the while on the other hand, recognizing that there is still a great deal of uncertainty about the wisdom of entirely leaving those multinational organizations and institutions behind. I'm sure that there are many within PiS who would like to be that party that was genuinely Eurosceptic in character, even to the extent of agitating for Poland leaving the European Union. But they know that the political costs of doing so would be so high that it's not a position that any party that aspires to govern Poland will take. So they've been operating for the last sort of few years in this kind of gap between, on the one hand, wanting to pursue this more independent path and getting some success from doing so, while at the same time having to deal with the fact that Poland is integrated with these multilateral institutions, and that state of affairs isn't going to change anytime soon.
Mm. Let me just ask before I go to the Poland A and B, because that was a really interesting part of the book. Just curious for I guess both of your perspectives. You guys have lived in Poland, you've stayed in Poland, and obviously there's the academic side and researching and all this stuff, right? And you guys aren't Polish, but is it one of those things where it's, as you're kind of like doing the research and then you're like living there, and I'm sure talking with people and all these things, where you're like, I can get both sides of this. I get the appeal for this. I get where there's an appetite for this. Maybe I don't fully agree, but that, because I find, again, especially for folks in the United States and maybe elsewhere, people only get access through. Most people don't go to Poland, right? Most people don't say, well, let me go boots on the ground, see what's kind of happening. Most people are getting it through, their black screens on their phones or on their computers, and they're just seeing some headlines, or they're, maybe they're going to read Good Change, which is a fantastic book, which gives a little bit more insight, obviously, and more data. But yeah, like I think that's a perspective a lot of people have. I mean, this is sort of a kind of a footnote here, I guess. But yeah, I guess what was it for you, for both of you, as you were writing this stuff and kind of getting in the data, but then also, living there and talking with real people, like, I don't really agree with this, but I get it. I can kind of see it. I mean, just kind of, I guess, phenomenologically, what was that like, I guess, for you guys as you were doing this?
Well, first of all, it was a fundamental part of our aim in writing this book, was not to write, yet another screed about the mortal threat to democracy in Poland. While we take that seriously, we take the sort of threat to democratic institutions seriously, and we write about it in detail. But what we really wanted to do was to explain where this comes from, right? And to explain it from the point of view of people that would support it, right? And in part, right, to sort of get to the nub of why this party was so successful in this period between 2015 and 2023. So that was our academic aim. And then just quickly to respond to what you're asking about personal experience. I mean, for me, that certainly shaped a number of the questions that we were, my take on a number of the questions we were grappling in this book is the fact that I spent a lot of time in the southeastern parts of Poland, in rural parts of Poland that are the heartland of the Law and Justice Party, of the Peace Party. I know a lot of people there, and I've spent a great deal of time there over a period of 20 years. And so it's absolutely the case that informed some of the ways in which I would be analyzing the academic questions that we were examining. And so I had this sort of experiential dimension, and even just a simple thing is if you know Polish villages in that region, not only do you understand the ways in which sort of traditional values and Roman Catholicism are part of everyday life, and you see the importance of it, but you also see change, right? That those values don't necessarily dominate everything. They're not all consuming. But then you also see the way in which those places have developed, and particularly the way in which they developed after, in the wake of PiS's social benefits program and the child benefit program, which really increased the amount of disposable income that families in lower income areas of the country would have, and that therefore materially improved people's lives, right, in those regions, and giving them a sense of being seen by the sort of the political establishment in Warsaw. And so absolutely looking at that and seeking to understand and therefore to explain the phenomenon of the law and justice government, and explain what the background to this headline concept of democratic backsliding, as it might be known, really is. So it's a good question, and it really was an important part of the process for me.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about the this Poland A, Poland B divide, and I think that this is sort of an essential part of what we're talking about here. This, as we explain in the book, is a significant oversimplification of differences. It was a divide which really emerged in a way in order to kind of both explain Polish political divides, but also in a way to kind of dismiss pejoratively that part of Poland that was seen as a brake on the country's development and a brake on its success. So the idea that you have rural areas, sort of backwater, what you would call in the US, the sort of flyover states, these kinds of places where everyone was migrating out of these places. Capital was less and less interested in investing. There was a sense of of this Poland B, of being these parts of Poland that were essentially just going to have to be left to wither away naturally. And what Law and Justice, what PiS was able to do, is to say to people who lived in these areas, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that you benefit from transition as well. So while economic growth might have been very impressive on a sort of a macro level, a lot of people living in rural areas in sort of peripheral parts of Poland weren't feeling those benefits, at least to the same extent as those in larger towns and cities. And so PiS said to these people, you deserve to benefit from transition as well. And what we're going to do is to restore, first of all, we're going to help you economically, but we're also going to do something a little bit more intangible, which is to restore a sense of prestige to you. We're going to allow you to be people who actually feel that you have control over your own lives. And one of the most significant pieces of information, pieces of data that I saw during the writing of this book was a graph showing the proportion of Poles who had been able to go on holiday outside their immediate sort of the region in which they lived, and how that had changed over the last 10 to 15 years. And by making it possible for Poles living in peripheral parts of Poland to feel empowered, often for the first time since the onset of transition, in ways such as being able to do things that they hadn't previously been able to do, like to put aside money to actually save up for their retirement independently, to be able to go on holiday somewhere that they hadn't previously been able to go to. This sort of restoring of prestige was an important part of PiS's political success. But it's something that you see in the writing of the book, certainly as Stan has explained, that it affected the way in which he approached how we tackle this topic. It was also noticeable for me during the initial period where we started to sort of think about the changes in Poland and about potentially writing something on that in the future, where the kinds of issues that were important to the people that I work alongside, that I come into contact with on a day-to-day basis in Warsaw, were very different from the issues that were important to the people who I would come into contact with in the place that I live, which is about 40 kilometers outside of Warsaw. So in that sort of getting out of the capital city into the countryside, into areas where there is a much greater sense of having been left behind by transition. And so when Law and Justice were attacking the Constitutional Tribunal or various other political institutions, and this was big news in the Polish media, big news in the international media as well, there was this big discourse about democratic backsliding and an assault on the rule of law. What the people were talking about when I took my son then to his kindergarten, talking with people outside the school gate, they were talking about the child benefit that had just been brought in. They were talking about the raising of the retirement age. They were talking about sort of manifest changes that Law and Justice had promised before the election and had been able to deliver. So an important part of Poland A and Poland B was not so much that all Poland A votes for the current governing parties and all Poland B votes for PiS, but rather that there are two kind of competing discourses about what has been happening since 2015, which at times intersect with each other, but at other times are almost kind of parallel to each other. And so you'll often find people particularly in Warsaw, who worry about the rule of law issue, who really have trouble conceiving why it is that despite all of that, despite the assault on the rule of law, despite the sidelining of the opposition in parliament, despite the turning of public media into an instrument of government propaganda, why people nevertheless would look at this party and think, well, these guys are taking care of my interests. Often we have in Poland two sides talking past each other, and that's been as much of a problem for the sort of the urban centres and their ignorance of what goes on outside their immediate environs than it has been both in terms of the unwillingness in some parts of rural Poland to consider the concerns of those urban centres in return. So this Poland A-B thing is really not so much about voting and not so much about political decision-making, but more about two ways of thinking about, two ways of approaching what is going on in Poland, and two perspectives that often are articulated by people at the same time, but are at cross purposes with each other.
Yeah, no, that's nicely stated by both of you. I think that, obviously for me here in the States, I can hear a lot of echoes of similar things over here, and I know other people have said so in other countries. So that is an interesting phenomenon of sorts. I mean, look, the whole urban rural divide has it's a kind of a thing that's been going on for a long time, but it does have a little bit more saliency, I think, maybe because of more connectedness, with the internet, things like that. I guess we can keep going about plan A, plan B a little bit. There's all these broader socio-demographic elements of the divide. You guys talk about age, education, income, religion, gender, residence, all these things in the book with some wonderful graphs and tables. But I guess there's this, that's more of a big picture kind of thing, right? You also talk about that Poland was prosperous, modernizing, secular, and urban, juxtaposed with a kind of traditionalistic, devout rural. But that's not, as you both have been mentioning, it's not this strict, discrete dichotomy, right? There's obviously variance, there's nuance, there's things that are kind of going in between. I guess, how does this play out? You can talk about a little bit more about some of the social demographic pieces that I mentioned, but I guess, how does this start to play out? I think one of the things that makes it unique, in a sense, from, let's say, maybe other quote unquote Western countries, is this like evolved views Polish voters have had on immigration, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, inequality, things like that. That is very interesting. I mean, again, here in the States, you're very party aligned. There's a history to that, of course, but it's like, well, yeah, I don't care really about, I mean, it's not as important to me about gay rights, but I'm going to have lower taxes, so I'm just going to vote for the party. And it sounds like here in Poland, it's not quite that discrete of sorts. Maybe it is in some cases, but there's a hybridization of sorts that's going on there. Maybe talk about how that evolved based on this kind of, demographics and the kind of urban-rural kind of, sort of dichotomy there.
So I'll say a couple of things, first of all, about how those dimensions are tied together. Mm-hmm. So the cultural and economic questions, maybe in very broad terms. I mean, we looked at, with the support for law and justice, we looked at different groups of supporters and the way in which those issues might motivate those different groups in different degrees, right? So there might be some voters who are above all motivated by the cultural questions, right? The Polish identity has to be defended. That's the most important thing for them. They're not as concerned about economic questions. There'd be other voters that are not particularly concerned by the cultural issues, but they're very attracted to the social redistribution, and particularly the idea that they can directly benefit from that. And then there are other groups of voters for whom both of those dimensions are important, and they might even become sort of mutually reinforcing, right? That this is a party, of course, that's delivering in all these areas that are important to me as a voter. So we try to really pull that apart in the sort of specific segmentation of the electorate. But then the other thing to say about the way, I mean, you asked about a kind of dynamism or change in views on some of these questions and a process of development. I mean, one thing that we noticed, or that we write about in some detail in the book, which is quite interesting, is on the cultural agenda issues. To a certain degree, that PiS was responding to what's often known in the literature, the academic literature on populism, as a kind of cultural backlash. So certain groups of voters, and again, without oversimplifying, particularly older, particularly rural or outside of the major cities, who feel that the pace of change is excessive, that their societies are changing in ways that make them unrecognizable, and they're concerned, and there's fear, right, of this change, right, of otherness in cultural terms, otherness in terms of sexual orientation, and etc. And so Law and Justice was responding to this and delivering a set of, not so much policies, because there weren't a huge number of policy implications, but certainly rhetoric around that. But what we then find is that there's a kind of reverse backlash, or a backlash to the backlash, when a party actually captures power and might be perceived to overreach on some of these questions. They're talking too much about LGBT plus rights, or the most significant example is in the question of abortion rights, where then this was the one area where a major policy change was enacted through a essentially captured court that Law and Justice had. And what was already a very restrictive access to abortion in Poland was essentially whittled down to almost nothing. So it became a virtual ban on abortion. And it turns out that this was not what the majority of Poles wanted. Law and Justice probably knew that and were concerned about that. The leadership was certainly concerned about that, but because there was pressure from parts of their constituency, they, for various reasons, chose to push this forward. But there was a massive backlash, including among their own voters, and including in the so-called Poland B, right, the rural, supposedly conservative areas, of people who, although they might not support abortion on demand, thought that the so-called abortion compromise, which had been delivered after 1989, was about right for Poland, and they didn't want to see further restriction of abortion rights. And so people in villages and small towns and peace voters were among those who came out onto the street to protest in 2020 against this pushing of the dial, in theory in response to cultural progressivism, but too far from the point of view of many voters in the opposite direction. And so there was a response to this ideological overreach, right? So responding to the cultural backlash, but doing so in a way that to many voters appeared excessive or suggested that peace itself had become the new hegemonic power, asserting its authority in all areas of cultural and political life, in a way that I think many Poles, including people who had voted for peace in the previous elections, were not pleased by, and that would have contributed to them perhaps changing their votes in 2023 when peace lost the election. So in terms of change, that was an interesting aspect that we observed, and it was an important factor in the party losing power in 2023.
Ben, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth noting that the kinds of questions that Polish politicians are having to deal with have changed quite significantly. You mentioned immigration earlier. It used to be that immigration, if it was an issue at all, it was that was politically salient. It was about what parties are going to do to try to make sure that we don't lose more people to Western European countries through outward migration. The issue is now one of whether and to what extent Poland needs to bring in immigrants, what that's going to look like, how to deal with that, how to handle that need for bringing in migrants in a way which is politically palatable for the majority of voters. And so we've had a situation over the last 10 years or so in Poland where there have been significant influxes of migration. I mean, most people will think of the influx of refugees from Ukraine after the onset of the full-scale war. But even before that, there were significant levels of migration from non-EU countries to Poland, which occurred at the same time as the government was increasingly articulating this anti-migrant rhetoric. While on the one hand, they were talking about the problems of immigration, particularly from countries that were sort of culturally different from Poland. At the same time, they were presiding over a significant period of increased migration. So, and the response of the current governing party has not really been strongly to push back against that narrative, to make the case in explicit terms for immigration, but rather to try to kind of echo what PiS was saying during its time in power, while trying to be a little bit softer in the rhetoric that they use. So issues like immigration have become politically salient as a result of that changing realities, but not really in a way which either of the two major parties can fully control. So one of the stories essentially that we tell in the book is that issues like this, like immigration, like LGBT plus rights, like abortion, have been issues that it's been possible to create political divides over and to get political capital out of. But they've not really been issues that politicians have really been able to control with all that much sustained success. While certainly the debate has changed on the migration issue, it's one which politicians have had to contend with, while at the same time recognizing that Poland's labor markets need migration, that it's not going to be an issue that they can ignore. And so in the same way that they can't control entirely sort of how much sort of pushing back against LGBT plus rights the Polish society is willing to tolerate, or how much change on the abortion issue Polish voters are willing to tolerate. By the same token, they've also not really been able to control the narrative entirely on the issue of immigration. So the cultural backlash that PiS has experienced is, I think, one which has shown up the extent to which it's easy enough to politicize issues, to create political divides over issues like LGBT plus rights and over abortion or over immigration. But it's much more difficult to sort of control those issues after you've politicized them. One of the things we found with LGBT plus rights, for example, was that it worked for a time, and then after a point, even those who were more skeptical, who were more conservative on these issues, started to look at this and say, well, where has this obsession come from? Why are people who maybe family members or people I work with, people I deal with on an everyday basis, I may not necessarily approve of their sexuality or be entirely comfortable about their sexuality. But on the other hand, I don't want to see these people bullied by those in power. So these kinds of issues have been quite difficult for both PiS and the parties currently governing to navigate, because they're very politically volatile, and for that reason, it's very easy to create political divides over them. It's much more difficult actually to control those divides once you've created them.
Yeah, that's again, there's a lot of things there that kind of resonate with some of the things here in the States, but it is interesting how it's a bit different. Okay, so I guess just two big, I guess, kind of topics. Again, there's so many wonderful things you guys talk about in the book, but I guess the one question I have here is for PiS. There, you talk about you've mentioned a few times there was an assault on Poland's institutions, the judiciary, the prosecutorial service, the civil service, parliament, state-owned companies, public media, etc. What's, I guess, the critique of that? Obviously, there's the obvious critique, but obviously, the piece that's here is that they did give the Polish people many things. You talked about social spending programs, how the 500 plus policy, things like that. So it's a mixed bag of sorts. It's what it sounds like. It's like there's obviously some, if you will, insults to certain institutional things, but then there's also some things that the people were getting. Otherwise, they voted for them. There were some things that there was some public appeal. What's the kind of story here?
Well, I mean, the other thing, just to quickly add to that, is that as I said, we don't underestimate the seriousness of this assault on democratic institutions for Poland's democracy. But we're also more interested in analyzing the reasons for this attack, how it was conducted, and why the electorate didn't punish this attack. Because most of the key changes happened between 2015 and 2019. And in the 2019 parliamentary elections, PiS increased its vote share from 38% to an unprecedented 44% of the vote in the election of 2019. So they significantly expanded their support. So why? That was the question we were sort of seeking to answer. And to a significant degree, it's because they were delivering on promises in other areas that were concretely affecting people's lives for the better as those people perceive them. It didn't hurt that the Polish economy was absolutely booming at this period in time. It was an extraordinary period of general economic optimism and growth. Of course, the Polish economy has been growing in an almost uninterrupted way for a few decades now, but this was arguably the best period almost before the pandemic, essentially, between about 2016, 17 and the pandemic. So that helped, of course, because there was money in the budget to spend and the general mood of economic optimism that leads people to be satisfied enough with the political status quo in many cases. But then the other dimension was some people were convinced by PiS's narrative that these institutions needed to be changed because they were the product of a set of rotten compromises after 1989 that had served the interests of particular elites, and hadn't served the interests of the wider people, and hadn't been fair in the way that they'd given access to power to all sort of political options across the spectrum, the ideological spectrum in Poland. So these institutions were presented as being corrupt, dominated by liberal elites, and therefore in need of change, in need of reform. And in some cases, this narrative wasn't entirely untrue, certainly not from the point of view of many Polish people. So the judiciary, for instance, they're on various empirical measures, the functioning of the judiciary was poor in the time that it would take for processes to run through. Instances of corruption. And if you talk to a lot of everyday people in Poland who had any experience with the judiciary, that's the kind of thing that they would mention. So the idea that the judiciary needed reform was probably pretty common across Poland. Now, what kind of reform happened? Well, it was a politicization of the judiciary that made the problems with the functioning of the judiciary even worse, so that cases take even longer and so on. But some people among peace supporters did believe that what the party was trying to do something that needed to be done, sort of taking Poland's institutions away from these elites, liberal and post-communist elites that had dominated them against the interests of the Polish people. But then there was another group that probably were not particularly keen on what peace was doing in these institutions, but in broad terms had a perspective of, well, all these Warsaw elites, they're constantly fighting with each other over these institutions. They're all hopeless. All these institutions will always be corrupt. Doesn't make much difference who's in there and who's not. Let them shake it up a bit, and at least these people, this political party, is giving us something at the same time. So they might not be very keen on the changes, but would be willing to accept them in the context of other key promises being delivered in a way that was demonstrable, in a way that was visible. So I think that's the sort of broader context. Of course, I'm simplifying here, but it gives you a sense of why the party was able to do that and how different groups among its supporters might have looked at it.
Ben?
I mean, there's a danger, especially when writing a book like this, which in many respects is sort of a retrospective analysis of stuff that happened, as Stan said, between 2015 and 2019, is to kind of project a coherence and sort of a plan to it that it wasn't necessarily the case when it was all unfurling. One of the things that is characteristic about this period was that because the Law and Justice didn't have the kind of supermajority that would allow them to make the same kind of changes of constitutional level that were possible in countries like Hungary, for example, where essentially the government was able to write a constitution that reflected its own sort of vision of the state and political priorities. What Law and Justice had to do during this period was kind of, in a kind of an experiential way, see just how much illiberalism and how much institutional change the public was willing to tolerate. And it turned out that actually they were willing to tolerate quite a lot, as long as Stan was saying, it was accompanied by significant benefits in the form of economic growth, in the form of a sense of restored prestige and a general sense of competent governance. One of the key things that critiques that Law and Justice, and in particular Jarosław Kaczyński, had been making for years was that liberal democracy as a political system enshrines what he called a kind of an impossibilism, just to literally translate from the Polish. This idea that what liberal democratic institutions do is they make things impossible. They constrain governments to the extent that anybody with different ideas beyond a very narrow scope of possibilities is prevented from doing what the majority of voters want, because the institutions like the Constitutional Tribunal in particular simply won't let that happen. So one of the arguments that PiS made before the 2015 election was that some degree of institutional change is going to be needed, because otherwise the Constitutional Tribunal is simply going to tear down everything that we want to do in economic policy, in social policy, all the changes that we want to make that we have promised you as a democratically elected government. And so that made it possible, I think, for them to proceed with some quite radical changes right from the beginning. The perception that many of these institutions weren't really functioning in the interest of the majority of Poles. Many were remote in terms of how they communicated what they did and their rationale for doing it. And just a general sense that a lot of the population had that, okay, maybe these institutions are nice to have. Maybe liberal democracy is, on paper, a good thing. But if it's not working in our interests, then what we need rather is a democracy where a government gets elected on the basis of a set of promises and then goes ahead and delivers them. And so one of the reasons I think why people tolerated these changes for the length of time that they did was precisely because Law and Justice said, what we actually need to understand by democracy is governments making promises and delivering on them. And what they were able to do in the first couple of years, certainly of their term in office, was to make some quite sort of eye-catching statement deliveries on policies that they promised. And so that, I think, blunted some of the critique, sort of some of the backlash against their institutional changes for some time. The problem, though, is when you start populating these institutions with your own people, when it sort of penetrates through to the public awareness that the Constitutional Tribunal is now essentially yours, when it's clear that the judiciary is increasingly coming under the whip hand of the Ministry of the Minister of Justice, you reach a point where you start to become responsible for what these institutions do or don't do, as was the case with the abortion law, for example, where the Constitutional Tribunal, dominated at that point by Law and Justice appointees, essentially ruled that abortion was, to all intents and purposes, illegal in its entirety. When you've populated those institutions with your people, you start to own what those institutions do. And one of the reasons why Law and Justice became not the beneficiary, but rather sort of started to suffer from those institutional changes was because of a perception that it now was responsible for the actions that those institutions were taking. It wasn't possible for them to say, well, we didn't want to change the abortion law, rather it was the Constitutional Tribunal that did it, because people were well aware that the Constitutional Tribunal by that stage was essentially doing Law and Justice's bidding and has continued to do so. So there was always going to be a limit to the extent to which there would be tolerance for those for those changes. Certainly during their first period in office, Law and Justice were able to benefit from the fact that there was limited appetite to defend those institutions from a sort of a coordinated assault by the executive, as long as the executive was delivering on other fronts. But when that stopped being the case, suddenly the executive was left having arrogated to itself a substantial amount of political power with the responsibility for pretty much everything that those institutions were then doing. It was no longer possible for them to say, well, we wanted to do this, but the Constitutional Tribunal made it impossible for us to do so. Once you populate the Constitutional Tribunal with your own people, you end up owning what it does.
Mm-hmm. That's deeply fascinating. It's I appreciate the perspective you guys took at this of trying to understand, well, how is this working? Why is this happening? Because I feel like that's much better. You're going to get a much more clearer picture of how these things are being able to be used. The last question I have here is sort of future oriented. So I think I kind of mentioned in the beginning, again, headlines, everyone's talking about the amazing GDP of Poland. Poland's economic stance is probably one of the best in Europe at the moment. Again, we're at the closing end of 2025. And I've been hearing that for at least a year, that Poland's economy is fantastic. What's Donald Tusk and the coalition government doing right over there that maybe now other countries in Europe and maybe even other countries generally can be like, okay, like post-pandemic, what are you all doing over there? What's Poland getting right economically at the moment? And where do you see it going, I guess, for them?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that neither of us are economists, and I'm certainly not. So I can't give you sort of an expert judgment on that. I can talk about the political developments of it, but I can the political dimensions of it. But I can also give a non-expert response, and that is, I mean, the first thing to say is it's not thanks to Donald Tusk that, as I mentioned before, like this. I mean, this growth has been continuous, and the particularly burgeoning growth. If anything, sort of really took off during PiS's time in government for various reasons, and I don't think either PiS or Tusk can really take the credit that it's related to a set of sort of background structural factors that the Polish governments are not really responsible for, and it's connected with Poland's particular position within a set of wider supply chains and its ability, particularly supply chains that are connected with Germany, by the way, and supply chain positions that Poland is able to fill based on being both low cost relatively, of course, but at the same time to have a convenient European location and a highly educated and motivated workforce. And so that sort of sweet spot of being a sort of developed, connected, well-educated country while still being relatively cheap, compared to other options, is at the root perhaps. But the problem, of course, is how long that situation can continue, and it just has continued and keeps continuing, and Poland's growth continues to impress, but it can't go on forever. And again, I'm not an economist, and even if I were, I would be wary of predicting. But you would be concerned, I think, about the direction of the German economy, for instance, and given how important that has been in growth in Poland. But the Polish economy, on the other hand, has turned out to be, as you suggested before, incredibly resilient to a whole set of buffetings from the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9 to bouncing back well from the COVID pandemic and a whole range of other factors. But I would say that at the moment, the optimism is not quite as great as it was. I mean, let's say public optimism is not as great, right? So the mood economically was at its sort of height of public confidence in that period between around 2017 and 2020, as I mentioned, and it has actually gone down a bit now. So the mood is not quite the same as it was during those years, in part because and this was part of the story of PiS losing power, by the way, is it's not that there was no impact of the various buffetings that the country went through with the COVID pandemic, then particularly the war, right, and the energy crisis and the resulting inflation pressures, right? So remember that inflation in Poland, was getting up towards 20%, right, at the worst time. Now it's dropped right back down again, but never the effects of that are still there, and that was another part of the story of PiS's defeat, by the way, was that the very favorable macroeconomic conditions that PiS enjoyed in its period of pomp then seriously declined after the pandemic and the war, both of which have had economic impacts. But nevertheless, Poland remains this incredibly dynamic success story, and if you go there, you can feel it. It's not the case all over the country, of course, but there are parts of the country that even despite the progress that PiS made, or the declared progress that PiS would take the credit for, continue to be relatively stagnant compared to the major centers. the small and medium-sized towns, many of them continue to shrink. In fact, most Polish towns continue to shrink. And that demographic crisis is going to be one that's also going to be a real challenge for economic growth. And is another reason why, despite the anti-migrant climate in Poland on many fronts, that's, the question of meeting the demands of labor markets is going to be a very tricky one to balance in Poland going forward. So without having any specialist knowledge to share with you, it can't go on forever, this period of extraordinary growth. And yet it just keeps on keeping on. And the Polish economy is really has shown itself to be very resilient. We'll see for how much longer.
Ben, what are your thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I think just to touch on what Stan was saying towards the end of his of what he was saying, is that the issue of immigration here is crucial because both sides of the political debate are currently in this position of knowing that Poland, particularly because of this demographic crunch that's ongoing, is going to need higher levels of immigration in order to be able to maintain this economic miracle that it's been experiencing really over the last 10 to 15 years, and reaching its high point just before the pandemic. In order to be able to sustain that, it's going to have to make hard decisions that could potentially have significant political impacts in other areas. On the one hand, it's necessary for parties to be seen to be opposing immigration on the basis of the cultural impact that it's likely to have on Poland, moving from a broadly mono-ethnic society into one which is increasingly noticeably more multi-ethnic and multicultural, even in smaller towns that only a few years ago were really not all that diverse. How to deal with that at the same time, while having quite significant public opposition to migration, particularly from Muslim majority countries, while at the same time recognizing that it's going to be necessary for immigration to continue to occur if this economic success is going to be sustained. It may not be much of a priority for young people right now, but a lot of middle-aged Polish people are starting to look towards a horizon of the next 20 to 30 years and think, well, who is going to be paying my pension when it's time for me to retire? And that mediates to an extent what they might or might not be thinking about the issue of immigration, because there may be people who are in a cultural sense genuinely opposed to increasing the level of immigration, while at the same time, in an economic sense, recognizing the rationality of it. And so it's how Poland will balance the economic imperatives that it faces that make it possible to sustain what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, and the growth and civilizational change that people have got used to and started to regard as part of what is normal in recent years. With, on the other hand, this recurring sense of a need to try to preserve something distinctively Polish about Poland, which inevitably will involve at a certain point a kind of nativist pushback against the kind of cultural changes that we've been seeing. So whichever government, whether it's the current government somehow manages to get a second term in office, which is looking increasingly unlikely, or whether peace returns potentially in tandem with Konfederacja, another radical right party, either of those governments is going to face the same kind of problem, essentially. How to balance economic growth and general sort of the movement of Poland away from a peripheral economy to one of Poland's to one of Europe's more important economies, with at the same time the sense that it is important to try to preserve something distinctively Polish about Poland. Both sides of the political debate are going to have to deal with those issues, and it's going to be a problem for both of them as to how to square that circle.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how that goes, because in one sense, if you're thinking a little bit more outside of Poland, you can say, look, Germany's, not at the height of where they were economically 10 years ago. There's some challenges usually, in France. There's obviously Ukraine and Russia are having their conflict. Here's the moment. Poland can rise in the East and really, become not just great for themselves, but great for the region and maybe for Europe. But I think you're right. I think that balance of, not biting off more than you can chew, not being able to do too many things will be critical. Stan, Ben, this was too much fun. I really enjoyed this conversation. You're both of you wrote a great book, and again, there's so many things I could continue to ask you, but I'll just have to get you both on here at some other point. But thank you so much for giving your time, your wisdom, your energy. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.